Before I start, if there's anyone that listens or listened to any of the recordings, I'd love to hear if there's anything that can be changed about the recording. Is the audio okay? Is everything's okay? If anyone has any comments about it, please let me know, and I'd be happy to deal with it.
Came out real good.
Okay. Good evening, my dear friends, and welcome to the fifth lesson of the world of Kabbalah. We're approaching the end, and as we mentioned previously a number of times, that the beginning is in the end and the end is in the beginning, right? That the purpose for everything is realized and actualized at the lowest levels. So as we approach the end of the course, we're approaching the deeper parts of the ideas, the deeper ideas in the world of Kabbalah, and it'll bring us full circle to the beginning of it all, and that will happen next week. But today, we're going to talk about adversity. We all face it in our lives in some way or another, whether it's a personal goal, it's in our family life, business life, spiritual life. There could be many different ways that we can be challenged and struggle with things that we feel we may not be able to overcome, maybe too powerful for us, etc. And the question we will ask ourselves and hopefully get an answer to is, how do we overcome the challenge and not capitulate, not give in to the struggle, not crumble in the face of this adversity? And it could be, what do we tell ourselves and what do we tell others maybe that turn to us in these situations? Take a moment and write down on a piece of paper if you have something, a one-liner, a one sentence that you either tell yourself or that you tell someone else when facing these moments, these challenges, or if someone asks you for guidance. Do you have a one sentence thought that you tell yourself or others? Write it down if you do. If you'd like to, we can give a few moments if anyone wants to share. And yeah.
I say when I have the first happening, face it and accept it.
Face it and accept it.
That you come out on the other side if you believe and trust. And I just say trust.
And you'll come out on the other side if you believe and trust. You come out stronger. Strong or stronger? Stronger. Okay, beautiful. Anyone else? Okay, today we're going to be exploring a fascinating approach, a Kabbalistic approach to this problem. But first I want to remind you where we're holding in the course. And I just want to go over a few key terms that we learned already, but I understand that there were a lot of key terms we learned. We're in lesson number 5. So we learned most of them. We went through most of them. I just want to bring a few to the forefront that we will be addressing in this lesson. So just to remind ourselves, if you open the back part of your maps, the first one I want to remind you of is in lesson 3.1, the very first term, or Ein Sof, right? The infinite light, God's infinite light, which refers to God's infinity. Remember I'm I should have put it right afterwards. Elokus or Elokut, right? Like that's 2.5. And lesson 2, the fifth one, 2.5, Elokut, godliness. Okay, then Sefirot or Sephiros, that's 2.3. The first number is the number lesson, and the second number is the number word in that lesson. So the first one is 3.1, or Ein Sof, then Sephiros, which is 2.3, then, or Sephirot. It's the way I pronounce it Ashkenazically with a Suf at the end is there's an S or a T, but it's the same word. Well, you have a question? Okay. And then Elokus or Elokut, that's godliness. And then we have Bia. Remember, that's from the first lesson, 1.2. Those are the three lower worlds that were created. Bria, the beginning of creation. Bria is the beginning of creation. Asiya is the end, is our world. It includes the physical Asiya, our world. And one more term that I want to remind you of is a term we had in lesson 1.3, Yeshut or Yeshus. Yesh means I am, I exist, not I, existence. Yeshut means existence. Bia, if you remember from lesson 1, Bia is existence, I exist. Right? Just like the garments, thought, speech, and action, I exist. It's separate from the person, even if it feels very close even if it feels very close to its source and identifies with its source, it is an existence, it's Yesha. So these are the 5 terms that we're going to be covering. We have some more terms we're going to learn in this lesson. Just wanted to cover that before we continue. Now, if you turn back to the back side of the map, we learned in the earlier lessons about the vast difference between God's infinity or Ein Sof and his limited and defined Sephirot. Okay, so the green is the finite. True, it's Atzilos. True, it's not an independent identity, but it's still finite, right? There's 10, not 11, 10 and not 9. That's finitude. That's finite. And then there's the Or Ein Sof, the yellow. The yellow is infinity, God's infinity. It's not God himself. We'll deal with that, or attempt to deal with that next week. But God's infinity. However, there's one serious problem we didn't address, and that is, how did we get from infinity to the finite? Yeah. How did that transition take place? Imagine you're a history teacher, yeah, and you're presenting a lecture on how things were in North America in this country before it was a country, 1750, and you're describing people under the rulership of the British monarchy, and that's your lesson on the first day of school. You come back the next day and you give a lesson on the year 1820, but you didn't speak about what happened in between 1750 and 1820. What are your students going to think? He probably is thinking about a different country, right? In other words, we all understand that when you go from one extreme to another, and this is one extreme to another, even within the same country, with the same people, this is all within a very, could you imagine going from infinite to finite? There must be a point of transition when the infinity gives room, or something happens that that becomes finite. Now, we all know what happened between 1750 and 1820. It all started with a shad heard around the world, right? And so today we want to talk about the shad heard around the Seder Hishtalshalos. So the shad heard somewhere there before the world was created that caused this transition and brought our world into being. So this is what we're going to try to discover today, is this transition. Now, we are now going to read one of the most famous teachings in Kabbalah. This is from the Arizal. I'm going to read it first, but then we are going to refer back to it and sort of break it apart and try to digest it. But first, we'll just read it. You can try to understand it, and you may understand certain parts of it. If you've studied before, you may understand more than if not, but we'll dissect it after we, on the other side. Text 1, this is page 143. Before Atzilut was emanated, and before the creations were created, a simple divine light filled all of reality. It had no aspect of beginning or end. It is called Or Ein Sof, the infinite light. When it arose in his will to create the worlds and to emanate Atzilut, he contracted his infinite light, and an empty space emerged. He then projected downward a single straight line from his circular light, devolving into this empty space. And within this empty space, he emanated, recognize that, Atzilut, created, Bria, fashioned, Yetzira, and made, Asiya, all the worlds. Okay, so within this empty space, God creates these 4 worlds. Okay, this is a heavy text. Let's focus. Let's take it apart a little bit. And okay, so the text begins by saying that in the beginning, in other words, before Atzilut was emanated, there was a simple divine light, and it filled all of reality. Yeah. It had no aspect of beginning or end. In the first paragraph of text one. In other words, before the world was created, there was only one thing. There was Hashem's infinity. By definition, that precludes Seder Hishtalshalut, right? The order of devolution. It precludes Keter. It precludes Tohu. It precludes Atzilus. It precludes Biyah. It precludes everything. 10 Sefirot. Any name, any concept you bring is precluded by a simple divine light that has no beginning or end. Now, the text links it. He calls it in the first line of the 3rd paragraph. He says he then projected a straight line from his circular light. He calls this circular light. Why does he call it circular?
No beginning, no end.
Very good. No beginning, no end. Yeah. So how do we get the 10 Sefirot? How do we get Atzilus? And the answer is the central theme of this text, and that is, rather than a transition, a simple transition from infinity to finitude, just like a child, a student transitions from pre-algebra to algebra, or a child transitions into adulthood, right? Here, there wasn't a transition. There was a significant disruption, a pulling back that enabled everything that came afterwards to come. Now, What is the word for this disruption? The word is tzimtzum. This is a word that I'm sure many of you have heard. And the basic translation of tzimtzum is like a reduction, a contraction. Now, sometimes this tzimtzum that's referred to in text 1 is many times referred to as tzimtzum harishon, the first tzimtzum, because there are many contractions. We'll soon, today's lesson, we'll talk about two of them, two of the major ones, but there are many more between all the different worlds and all the different levels. Now, this tzimtzum enabled a limited projection of this infinite light into the empty space that's now formed. And this is referred to a straight line. In Hebrew, it's called a kav. What's the difference between a circle and a line? I mean, there are many differences, but in the context that Jay mentioned before, that a circle is infinite because it has no beginning or end. What is a line? How is a line different? It has a beginning and end. Very good. So a line connotes finite. And this brings us to the first two terms we will mention today, and that is, the first one is tzimtzum, or tzimtzum harishon. It's usually referred to as tzimtzum. Today, again, we're talking about the first tzimtzum, so it's tzimtzum harishon. That is the act of concealment and contraction. And then we have what comes after the tzimtzum, and that is kav, a line. Okay, this is the general definition. Now, we just said something that seems to imply that our reality, which is the physical asiya, is in a space that's devoid of God, right? God contracted himself, he removed himself, and although he let shine forth a kav, but it's a finite. It's finite. It's not elokus. It's not godliness. It's not infinity. It's finite, right? It's a kav. So that seems to imply that in our world, God isn't really present. That seems to be a little difficult to say. Now, we already know that we need to, when we're studying Kabbalah, we need to strip the concepts that we're talking about from the physicality, that from the physical terms we are addressing them with. This was true, as we discussed in lesson 1, with Biyah, and then with Atzilus, and of course with Or Ein Sof. But the text, if you read the text of the Arizal, it sounds like there is a space in which our world exists that's devoid of God's infinity. Now, I'm not going to get too carried away with this, but I do want to point out, and we could continue after 8:30 if there a question comes up about it. I do want to point out one interesting thing. This Shabbos is the 19th of Kislev, this coming Shabbos. It's considered the Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. It's a very long story. If you want to hear more about it, come Friday night at 6 o'clock for First Fridays, or Shabbos morning for Kiddush, and we'll talk about it. It's a big Hasidic holiday, but one of the things that caused this holiday is because at the beginning, when Hasidus started, there was great opposition. And the opposition actually started with this text. What caused the opposition to Hasidus was text 1 that we just read. There were many that read this text literally, and they said Tzimtzum is literal. God literally removed himself, and we are in this devoid space. True, God did let in a finite semblance of himself, but God himself is not here. right? And the Baal Shem Tov took a different approach. He said Tzimtzum is not to be taken literally. He didn't come up with this. We'll soon see a text from before him. But that was the approach he took. Tzimtzum is not literally, it's figuratively. Because we use the word contraction, but remember, we're using a human term. We're using a term that we use for physical things. So in order to use that term for God, we have to use it. It's used differently. It's just to help us understand the concept. But we can't think that God literally contracted himself and removed himself from a specific spot. But I don't want to get carried away with this. I just want to point out that although we are going to be addressing it as obvious that the Tzimtzum is not literal, there were many Jews that believed that Tzimtzum is literal. And this led to very big differences. Again, we can have continue the conversation a little later. There's actually an interesting joke story I recently heard. There was a guy, we'll call him Ruvain. Ruvain goes to his neighbor Shimon's house, and he asks Shimon if he could borrow, he knows he has a golden spoon. Ruvain asks Shimon if he could borrow his golden spoon. Shimon says, what do you need it for? So he said his daughter is bringing home her fiancé for the first time, and he wants to impress his future son-in-law. So he wants to show him a gold spoon. So Shimon says, you need to give me some collateral. So he takes off his coat, expensive coat, and he gives it them as collateral. Fine. The next day, Reuven comes to return the golden spoon, and he brings a little gold spoon together with it. Shimon takes the spoon back, and he sees the little spoon. He says, what's this? He said, you never believe it. Last night, the spoon had a baby. And because your spoon had a baby, I'm giving you the baby. Shimon thinks to himself, this guy is, I mean, this is insane, but he's giving him a golden spoon. He's going to take it. The next few weeks later, he comes and asks him if he could borrow his golden goblet, his golden Kiddush cup. Why? The family is coming over and he wants to impress them. He wants to make Kiddush in a golden goblet. Shimon remembers what happened last time. He gladly gives Reuven his golden goblet, and sure enough, after Shabbos, Reuven returns the golden goblet with a little baby golden goblet inside of it. And again, the same story, that his golden goblet had a baby over Shabbos. A few months later, it's time for the wedding. Those days, the wedding was in the house. He wants to decorate his house. He goes to Shimon and he asks him if he could borrow his chandelier. Chandelier was a masterpiece, and this would transform the house into a wedding hall. Shimon gladly gives it to him. After the wedding, Reuven comes knocking on Shimon's door, and he's empty-handed. He doesn't have the chandelier. So Shimon asks, what happened to the chandelier? So he says, it died. So he says, that's preposterous. A chandelier can't die. So he said, if a spoon and a goblet can have babies, a chandelier can die, right? So if we take things literally, we can get stuck pretty far. But so let's read text 2, A and B. We'll split them up for a moment, but here, this is a 17th, 18th century rabbi, an Italian Kabbalist. He says like this: those who wish to understand the Tzimtzum in a literal manner will be led to beliefs that contradict most of the fundamentals of our faith. First of all, we were explicitly taught in Isaiah, to whom do you compare God? And what likeness can you arrange for him? Yeah. So the fact that we're comparing God's contraction to any type of metaphor we might find in our world is in itself preposterous. If, however, you take the Tzimtzum literally, you are indeed imposing an image on God, an encompassing circle, an empty space, and a straight channel within that space. If it's literally, that means there is empty space. There is a circular space. There can't be a circular space. That's one reason. Another reason is that it's a problem with a passage from the Zohar. Text 2b. Additionally, the Zohar states numerous times that there is no place where he is not, from the highest of levels to the lowest of levels, and in every direction. If you suggest that the tzimtzum is literal, you are insinuating that there is a place devoid of him. For in this empty space, only a narrow channel descended. Or Ein Sof means infinite. If there is literally an empty space that literally doesn't have God in it, then not every space is infinite. Then not everything is infinite. Infinity isn't everywhere, which means that infinity isn't real infinity because there's an empty space. So how can Tzimtzum make sense? These are good reasons why we can't take it literal. So then what does it mean? If it doesn't mean literal, what does Tzimtzum mean figuratively? So for this, we have a text from the Alter Rebbe in text 3. And he says like this: the Tzimtzum does not mean that God's infinite light departed, God forbid. For in truth, as the Zohar says, there is no place devoid of him. This principle is also expressed in the Medrash. Why did God choose to reveal himself to Moses from within a thorn bush? To teach that there is no place devoid of God's presence, even a thorn bush. Right? God could have found other respectable places to reveal himself to Moses. Instead, so what does it mean? In this context, the meaning of Tzimtzum is that Or Ein Sof went from a state of revelation to one of concealment without actually departing at all. Okay, so let's in text 1, we read that there was a simple divine light that filled all of reality, right? In the first paragraph, a simple divine light that filled all of reality. What does that mean? According to the way where the Alter Rebbe is explaining Tzimtzum non-literally, it filled all reality. In other words, it was revealed. It was absolutely revealed. There was no place in all of reality that didn't, that God's presence, God's infinite presence wasn't revealed. What does it mean? He contracted his infinite light. So till now, we explained that contracted removed it. The Rebbe is saying, no, it doesn't mean removed. It means he concealed it. So if you're looking, you don't see it. But just because you don't see it, doesn't mean it's not there. Yeah. Now that the light is concealed in this area, now God projects a single straight line. What does that mean? It means he reveals a little bit. So God is in this empty space. God is there just as he was before. However, there is now room for something else because it's not revealed. It's only revealed enough that we can be aware of it. Yeah, we discussed the last week or 2 weeks ago, Sovev Kol Almin, right? Where God surrounds the world. What does it mean, surrounds? Again, it doesn't mean that he's outside the world. It means concealed. We don't see it. When we think about God, we think about him somewhere far away, as if he's surrounding the world. Yeah? So now we have 2 new terms. Gilui. Gilui means revelation. And here's a word that you may be familiar with, a variation of it. The word is halem. Halem means concealment. Does anyone know which other common Hebrew word this word sounds like or spells like? Is there another Hebrew word you're familiar with that this word sounds like? Huh? No.
How long?
What does ha'olam mean? Olam. What does olam mean? Okay. So for now, it means world. It could also mean eternity. We'll get to that maybe a little later. But it means world. In other words, our world is a concealment of God's light, infinite light. It's helam. Now, to help grasp this idea of concealment and helam, we're going to go back to an analogy we brought in lesson 2. With Newton. Newton is invited to a 6th grade class to teach something. And he realizes that if he teaches the 6th grade his revolutionary ideas of gravities, they're going to lose it. They're not going to know what's flying. So he thinks, you know what, let me just tell them a little bit about my life. But then he thinks, that's not what they asked me here to do. I'm not teaching them anything of my ideas, of what makes me me. So he realizes he has to teach them something of his idea. So what does he do? He works very hard to find a very limited aspect or something that's born out of his idea that can be understood by a 6th grade class. Something like how the chalk writes on the board, or any other type of example that they can see in their life around them. Now, this idea that he gives them, that he teaches them, how the bottle of water is standing on the table, yeah? Is that part of his idea? Sure. Would he walk into a room of his peers and share that as his idea? No. What did he need to go through in order to get that detail to deliver to the 6th grade classroom? He needed to experience a tzimtzum. He needed to experience a contraction. What is a contraction? Doesn't mean he forgot his ideas. If he would forget his ideas, he wouldn't come up with an example of his idea. What does it mean? It means he had to conceal it. He had to say, you know, I'm putting it away. I'm covering it up because I can't use that idea. But I have to find something from it that can make its way through into another reality, into another human being, that they'll be able to grasp it. Now, this idea that came through is a genuine part of the big idea. But it's not the big idea. You wouldn't say this is the big idea, but it is a part of it. Yeah? Does it make sense? Let's see this metaphor inside in a Hasidic discourse from the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe, text 4a. Consider the example of a teacher imparting information to students. The profound concept the teacher understands is incompatible with the student's mental abilities. True, the profound concept contains less significant elements that are compatible with the student's minds. Nevertheless, in the teacher's mind, these elements are filled with the profundity of the overall concept, and they therefore remain too deep to deliver to the students. In other words, when Newton thinks about the bottle of water before his contraction, when he thinks about the bottle of water, he thinks that's also too deep to deliver to students, because he's thinking of it in the world of his big idea. And because his big idea is too difficult to give to the students, the bottle of water is too. In order for him to extract the bottle of water from his big idea, he has to conceal the big idea. Yeah? That's what he's saying. The main obstacle here is that there's no distinction in the teacher's mind between the core of the concept and its less significant elements. Consequently, If the teacher proceeds to transmit this knowledge to the students, the teacher will deliver the full profundity along with the less significant components, and the students will understand none of it. So if Newton would have walked in knowing that the sixth graders wouldn't understand, and he would have said his whole theory with the example of the bottle of water, not only would the sixth graders not understand his idea, they wouldn't even understand what he's saying about the bottle of water. Because in his mind, the bottle of water is part of the big idea. The solution is for the teacher to conceal the entire concept, mentally pushing the whole idea aside and to approach it anew. The teacher can now distinguish between the idea's core and the more superficial elements. The teacher can then deliver the transmittable details without flooding these elements with the overwhelming complexity of the core concept. So the teacher has to go from sort of a conscious awareness to a back burner awareness of his idea in order for him to allow space to try to figure out what could the students understand. In other words, if I walk into a room and I just study the Hasidic idea, and I come in and I deliver the Hasidic idea, even if I could figure out an analogy that might be relatable, you'd probably tune out after the first few minutes because, well, maybe not after this course, because now you're already a little more familiar with Hasidic ideas, with Kabbalistic ideas. But if you weren't, you'd tune out after 2 minutes of not understanding a word. And therefore, anything relevant, I would say, afterwards would have no effect. Therefore, we have to start off with the relevant. We have to start off with the idea that is relatable. And then once the student can understand that, then we can try to trace it back to the big idea. And that's what happens. Students eventually can grow up, mature, and understand the depth of their teacher's mind. Even those ideas that he never actually gave his students in class. Now let's think about the analog. Let's think about God. God's default status is revelation, right? A person's default status is revealing. You only conceal when there's something else, right? If you're yourself in the world, there's no need to. Adam and Eve were created, they were created naked. There was no need for concealment. But since God is truly infinite, he has the potential of finite. There is the potential of finite. However, that potential of finite is within the big infinite. If you would have somehow met God before the Tzimtzum, you wouldn't see finite. You know maybe there could be finite, but you wouldn't see that. You wouldn't think about it because all you see is revelation. All you see is the infinite. However, once there is a contraction, once there's a concealment, now you reveal. So through the concealment, you're revealing that God can also manifest in the finite. And that finite can also be part of God, is also part of God. Because it's also within God. God only concealed it. He didn't remove himself. It looks finite. It gives space for finite. But underneath, it's only a concealment. Yeah? Now let's see the analog. Text 4b on page 152. So in text 4a was the metaphor of the student, the teacher, and the students. Now the Rebbe Rashab continues, the above parable allows us to appreciate the concept of tzimtzum. Before the tzimtzum, God's ability to express finite divinity was part and parcel of his prevailing infinity. Because the entire theme of Or Ein Sof before the tzimtzum is to reflect the infinite capacity of God's essence and to resemble it. Remember, it's a light. A light means it reveals its essence. God's essence is infinity. The tzimtzum enabled the separation of these two powers of expression. So now God can express himself not only in an infinite way, but even in a finite way. So now you can have an empty space, in other words, finite, and God is expressed in that finite too, in a concealed way. But God is expressed in the finite. Is that make sense a little bit? What's the finite? This empty space inside the big circle, the circle of light. No, but that's the empty space, that's the tzimtzum. What is then put in its place? The kav, the line, the straight line. Yeah. This is a revelation, but it's a very limited revelation. What is it reveal? It reveals God's finite power, so to speak. Right? Because it's a line. So it's God's power in the finite. When you look around, you have to look very hard to find, well, you don't really have to, but human nature is that it takes a long time to find God's infinite power. We expect a miracle like the splitting of the sea. We don't realize a blade of grass also reveals God's infinite power. But when you look at the blade of grass, the first thing you see is God's finite power. You don't see the infinite power. If you think deeply, you realize it's an infinite power. But that's not what's revealed. What's revealed in the empty space? Just a line. The God's infinite light is there. The circle is there. You just can't see it. You have to look, you have to think about it. You have to meditate. But it's very important to remember that it's only when we say a contraction, it's only a concealment.
So in other words, he didn't take anything out of the space. He just made it seem to us like there's a space.
Correct. He concealed whatever was in that space. Just like the teacher. The teacher didn't forget his idea. The teacher didn't send it out of his head. He just concealed it. My kids, sometimes when I'm teaching, when I'm giving a lesson, speaking on Shabbos, they love to fill in missing pieces of information that I miss out during a class or a speech. And it took many years for me to explain to them, because I didn't think they would understand it earlier, that there's a reason I'm not saying all the information there is to say during the speech or the class. If I would say everything there is to say, nothing would be absorbed. You have to pick one thing and speak about it. Yeah. So, but it's not that I don't know all of those pieces. In other words, sometimes they tell it to me as if they're teaching it to me. I enjoy it. I appreciate it a lot. It makes me very proud that they know so much. But it's just a metaphor that you can have something inside that you don't share because you're intentionally concealing it. Not because you're embarrassed of it, ashamed of it, or because it's because for the purpose of what you're trying to do, if you reveal it, it would defeat the purpose. If I were to teach everything I know about a specific verse, we'd never get anywhere in the parsha. So I have to conceal it. If God wanted to create worlds that would feel independent, and he would reveal everything there is to reveal, he would never get a world that feels independent. In order for him to get a world that feels independent, God removed himself, concealed himself in a specific space, and in that space created the world. Yes?
Clarify. So if someone sees, like, you gave an example, like with the grass.
Yeah.
If someone sees like a blade of grass, they're seeing basically like the line, the finite, the whole big picture, right?
Right. So usually when people speak about how they see God in the world, they usually tend to speak about how they see God in nature. In other words, the kav, a limited, they don't call it a miracle. Most people don't say the sunrise was miraculous. And even those who do don't mean it, usually don't mean that term miraculous. But really, the sun rising in the morning is a miracle. What does that mean, a miracle? Huh? It means that it comes from, that it wouldn't happen without God. In other words, it comes from God, God's infinite power. But the way we perceive it in a finite way. We perceive it that God is up there moving the sun around. If we would perceive God right here, right now, we would look a little different. We would act a little different, right? So we remove God. God did this intentionally. He removed himself from the space so we don't sense him everywhere. So what? Science? Science, yeah. The nature. Science is nature, right? And that's what it calls. Olam, which means world, which is biology, right? The world. Science, any form of science is olam, which means hell and concealment. It's exactly what it is. So when a doctor gives you a medication, that is God's infinite power doing its work. How do we perceive it? As God's finite power. It's concealed. We see a doctor giving us medication. Okay, this is what we just explained is the first tzimtzum. We are going to address now, just for a few minutes, I don't want to spend too much time on it, a second tzimtzum, which will give a different name to it. This is, we just explained how we transitioned from the infinite to the finite, but we're still in godliness. There's still no other identity. There's still no separate yeshut, right? There's still no self, an existence that feels itself. That happens between Atzilus and Bria. So between Atzilus and Bria, there was another tzimtzum. But here, there's a different name to this tzimtzum because you'll see it's a different type of tzimtzum. Let's read text 5. In his Eitz Chaim, Rabbi Chaim Vital is the student of the Arizal who wrote down the Arizal's teachings. He discusses a dividing curtain. Okay, this is not a tzimtzum. It's a dividing curtain between Atzilut and Bria. This curtain is the concealing garment that enables the creation of entities with a sense of independence. It is comparable to a physical screen that conceals light. Although some light succeeds in piercing the barrier, that light is merely a secondary product of the original light. Other sources explain further that this parsa, curtain, is akin to a parable's words, which entirely conceal the profound message of the analog. For example, consider the parable cited by King Solomon. He vested supernal secrets in mundane ideas that hide the mystical truths. One who reads these parables gains a mere glimmer that is incomparable to the core supernal secrets. Okay, let's just let's differentiate between the parsa and the tzimtzum, or the first tzimtzum. Give me a second here. Oh, 1 second. I just realized that there's some chats there. Give me a second while I manage a few things at once. Okay. Should say before the beginning. Right. Before the beginning of time. Yeah, okay. Let's open so I don't miss any part. Okay. let's take, we'll give two examples. The first example is, we'll use light. So let's say you're in a room and the sun is shining too strong. So what do? You put the curtain, close the curtain. Does the curtain totally block out the light of the sun? Usually not. The sunlight still comes in. But when you look at the light in the room, do you know that it's sunlight? Well, it depends. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. If you know the light's off, then you know the light's sunlight. But does it look like the sunlight that was there before you close the curtain? Usually not. Sometimes you may not even realize if the light is on or off. You may be confused if the light is on or off because of the way the sun is coming into the room. So the parsa, this tzimtzum between godliness and creation, existence, conceals godliness to the extent that although godliness, whatever comes through, is still God's light, but it looks different. It can be conceived, it can be perceived as something different, as independence. I can look like something outside of God. However, contrast that to the tzimtzum. The tzimtzum, there was an empty space, concealment, but then there's a thin line going through. But what's coming through that thin line? Pure sunlight. Yeah. So let's say you have a big window. You have two options. You can either put a curtain on the window, or you could fill in the window. You could put bricks and fill in and only leave a little space so that the sunlight that comes in won't disturb the whole room. Let's say you filled it up with bricks and now there's only a little sunlight coming through. It might be less sunlight than coming through the curtain, but it's 100% authentic sunlight. Whereas the sunlight that comes through the curtain, again, to the person standing inside, may seem like something totally different. Let's go back to the parable we said about the teacher and the student. So the teacher conceals his idea in order to reveal a detail of it to the students. But then there's another parable of a teacher and a student, and this is a parable. Why does a teacher use a parable? A teacher uses a parable because if the idea is too deep, maybe the student will understand the parable. But when the student understands the parable tells him nothing about the deeper idea. The hope is that when the student understands the parable, he will then figure out what the idea is. So he brings an example of King Solomon. King Solomon wrote a book, The Song of Songs. If you put the Song of Songs in English on a library shelf in the local library, which section of the library would you put the book? Romance, right? There's no mention of God in the book. It's a book about a man and a woman and the love that they share between each other. Why did the rabbis include it in the written Torah as one of the 24 books of the written Torah? Because they understood that the whole book is a parable. But imagine what King Solomon was thinking. He wanted to write a book about the relationship of God and the Jewish people. If he would have written a religious book, how many people would have opened it and read it? How many people would have truly identified with how close and intimate of a relationship I have with God? Many people would have thought, maybe the rabbi does, maybe the king does, maybe this person does. Me, I don't have such a relationship with God. How can I? I'm this little nothing. So King Solomon didn't write it like that. He wrote it in a language that every single one of us can understand and relate to. This is a book any person will pick up and not just read it and enjoy it, relate to it. Now, after they relate to it, now you come and tell them, by the way, whatever it says here is only a parable to you and God. Now, The facts are the facts. He's convinced of that. Now he has to just feel it a little. But it's more relatable, his connection with God, through the parable of the man and the husband and wife. But the parable is not the idea. The parable is something else. The parable is there to hopefully get the student to understand the idea. Whereas when Newton takes one point of his theory that manifests itself in the physical world that the sixth grade can understand, that's not a parable. That is the idea. Sure, it's only one detail. It's not the whole depth, but that is a part of the idea. That's like the sunlight coming through a little hole, whereas the parable is the sunlight coming through the curtain. So the first tzimtzum that God made in order to create space for worlds, that was where the light isn't altered. It's just a thin line of it, so to speak, a finite element of it. Whereas when God wanted to transition from godliness to selfishness, to independence, there God had to create something entirely new. Something that would, not entirely new, it is sunlight, but what looks entirely new. So that we can have the perception that we are separate from God. So, what happens? There's 10 sefirot. Each one of these sefirot is an element of elokus, of godliness. But this is good in Atzilus. In Bria, it has to feel itself, not God. So we put up a curtain, and now we have the 10 sefirot, but without God. And that's the human being. We have the 10 attributes, but we don't see that the sunlight is really God. We don't realize, we don't perceive that our 10 attributes are really godliness. We perceive them as independent kindness and discipline and wisdom and knowledge. We perceive it as ours. Really, it's not ours. It's the sunlight. But God wants us to perceive it as ours. Again, we discussed this because then we can take what we perceive as ours and reveal Him. That's the ultimate goal. We'll get into more of that next week. But there is a deliberate path here by God to create something independent, separate. And that is a product of concealment. Two types of concealments. First, the concealment that transitions from infinite to finite, but the finite is still godliness. There's still nothing independent. And then within that space, if you conceal it even further, this time with a curtain, now you can have something that feels independent. Bria doesn't feel so independent because it's very close. Asiya, us, we feel very independent. But we're still totally filled with God. God's everywhere. We just don't see it. Okay. I'm gonna finish the conversation of Tzimtzum in its Kabbalistic way. I want to spend, we have a half hour now. I want to spend at least a half hour. In the past lessons, I didn't spend as much time as I wanted on how this translates into our lives. So today I want to spend a little more time, but I hope I will stop for a few minutes if the concept of Tzimtzum, specifically the first concept of Tzimtzum, isn't understood. If there's an element that isn't understood, I will stop and take questions because I don't want it not to be understood before we go further. Does anyone have any questions on understanding this idea of Tzimtzum? Okay. So let's now, we're going to present, I want to present two relevant ideas from tzimtzum in our lives. Usually we know, it says in the Mishnah that we are supposed to emulate Hashem. We're supposed to emulate God. God is kind, we should be kind. God is merciful, we should be merciful, etc. However, or Ein Sof, the infinite light, if we were to emulate that, that could be quite problematic, right? Because what does infinite light mean? But there's nothing else. It's the only thing, right? So if we emulate God, that means that we present ourselves as the most, not just the most, the only important thing in the world, more important than everything else. And this can be very problematic. Let's look at text 6a, page 156. Those who are self-obsessed and narcissistic become engrossed in their desires and wishes and completely forget about God. Similarly, their self-obsession precludes loving others. Their self-love generates divisiveness because it doesn't allow them to tolerate others. They think that whatever someone else says or does is directed against them. Automatically, that's what they think. There was an incident that will illustrate this point. A fellow who happened to be a tremendous scholar and well-versed in Torah once had a private audience, Yechidus, with my great-grandfather, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch. This is the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. Rebbe, he complained, the others are stepping all over me in the study hall. They do not appreciate what I have to say. They do not behave properly toward me. And they do almost the exact opposite of my opinion. The Holy Rebbe replied, your ego expands throughout the entire study hall. Wherever anyone steps, it's bound to be on you. What an insightful story. We often get offended. Usually that happens when we put ourselves into a situation that we may have been better served not putting ourselves into that situation. You involve yourself in an argument, in a conversation, in an altercation, and then you're hurt when someone says something against what you're thinking or contrary to what you said. Okay. We'll get to that question soon. And we see this problem in many settings. In many settings, we see this problem of people getting, and if you think about it, it stems from a place that when we're engrossed in nothing else but our desires and our perspectives and what we think and what we believe. And by the way, this challenge is not just for such egotistical people or such corrupt people. The Rebbe is talking here about a great Torah scholar. And where was he having this challenge? Not on the basketball court or in the marketplace, in the study hall. This wasn't the case of people hurting each other's feelings to be malicious, or this was just, disagreements, etc. Let's see another detail in 6b. You will notice that the above story mentions that the individual felt like people were stepping all over him in the study hall. This is a highly instructive detail because a hall designated for Torah study is considered a miniature holy temple. Divinity is more acutely present and perceptible in a place filled with Torah study, similar to the presence of divinity within the holy temple. And despite that, despite finding himself in a place of divinity, this individual succeeded in maintaining a bloated ego, even in this holy place. This detail of the story was included to underscore that knowledge alone, without working on self-refinement, is woefully insufficient. So much so that one's ego will infiltrate even a miniature sanctuary. This proves the indispensability of avoda, the internal work of character refinement. We're learning a lot of Kabbalistic ideas over the last 5 weeks. And yes, we've tried to apply them to our lives. But the Hasidim that would dedicate themselves to studying Hasidus and Kabbalah and were lacking avoda were not looked at in very high regard. Hasidus, although it has a philosophy, and although it has an exercise that needs to be, the brain needs to be developed, and it needs to think about all of these things, if it's not used to improve my character, then we miss the whole point. What is the avoda? What is the avoda? What is the toil? What is the work? This is divine service. Avodas Hashem, divine service. What is the avoda? To have a tzimtzum-like attitude. What does a tzimtzum-like attitude mean? It doesn't mean I'm nothing. It doesn't mean I'm not here. What does it mean? I'm concealed. If I'm here and there's someone else, it's not about me right now. Not I'm not here. I am. But the other person shouldn't feel like I'm here. The other person should feel that I'm here for them. They don't feel my existence intruding on their issues. When they're trying to share with me something that's bothering them, it doesn't become, oh, and I had the same thing. Oh, I know exactly what you mean. I also experienced this. It's not about you. We have to have a tzimtzum attitude. We have to conceal ourselves. Because if we don't, then the other person, all he feels is my presence. You know, the guy, he was going on a date and he's talking and talking about himself, all his accomplishments and all his achievements. So after an hour, he thinks that he turns to the girl and he says, you know what? I just realized I've been talking for an hour about myself. Enough about me. Tell me, what do you think about me? Yeah. So, so if we don't have tzimtzum in ourselves, and it's not just for other people, it can also be ego. Ego, you know what the acronym of ego is? Edging God out. We leave no space for God in our lives if we have a healthy ego. Healthy, I don't mean healthy in a good way. Healthy, I mean a strong and vibrant, unhealthy ego. But here's an interesting point. Let's think about for a moment, why did God, in other words, we're trying to create a tzimtzum in us when we're dealing with God or with other people. There's a simple thought process. When someone does you a favor, what's your reaction? You might have a verbal reaction, thank you very much, but inside you have a reaction, I would love to do them a favor. I would love to reciprocate whatever it is they did to me, yeah? Let's think about this for a second. God's infinite light filled the whole world. God went on a tremendous journey, and we know how hard it is to conceal part of ourselves. God concealed part of himself to create all of these Seder, Ishtalshus, and all these words. Why? To create me and you. So God went through that, contraction we think sometimes about labor, right? Think about, even though it's not the same thing, but it's a very painful process. Try concealing your ego. It's very painful. It can be very painful. God went through this process to create me and you. Or if we think about that a little bit. Our initial reaction should be, how can I remove myself from the picture and do something for God? Text 7 on page 159. Reciprocation is a natural response. God set aside, figuratively speaking, as we mentioned, his great infinite light and concealed it. He did this due to his love for us, to raise us up to him. For love induces one to restrict oneself for another. When we reflect on this deeply, our souls will spontaneously be ignited to reciprocate. We will feel motivated to forsake everything in order to cleave to him. So when we find it hard in our busy lives, we seem not to be able to make space for God. There's just not enough time. I don't have enough mental space and enough emotional space. Let's think about everything he did for us. Think about all the things in the last few lessons we've learned. Every day we say the Shema. What is the Shema? We proclaim our love for God, yeah? What's the blessing we say right before the Shema? So, depending on Ashkenaz or Sfard, you say Ahava Rabbah. We don't, we say Ahavat Olam. Ahavat Olam means, so love to the world. That's literally what it means based on the translation of Olam that we said before. But you had another translation for Olam, or you had another translation for Olam? Eternity. Olam means eternal. So usually when we translate in the prayer, Ahavat Olam Ahavtanu, God loves us in eternal love. But based on what we're saying now, we can understand it has another meaning to it. It means God loves us, Olam, he loves us so much that he went through all of this mishigas to create a limited physical world in which we can exist as independent identities, independent even of him, seemingly. All that we can, how does the blessing continue? That we could learn Torah and do mitzvahs, we can do all these things. That's why he did it for us. That it creates a reciprocal feeling towards us, and we proclaim Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, v'ahavta. We love you so much, we're willing to give our lives for you. So the first lesson we learn from the Tzimtzum is taming our ego. That if you find yourself acting like Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, like God's infinite light before the Tzimtzum, so then we need to have a self-imposed Tzimtzum that reminds us and inspires us to make space for others, and not just for others, but make space for God. Now, what do we mean make space for God? God is everywhere. Make space for God in my life. Allow God to enter my life, my day, my morning, my evening, my afternoon, my sleep, my wake, my food, my business, whatever it is I do. That's the first number one. Number two, if we think about it for a moment, what was the first thing God did to create this world? No, God didn't create light. Light emanates from God, right? Light reveals the source. What is the first thing God did in order to bring about the world? No.
Separated light and dark.
Where was light and dark?
Yeah, he had to create it.
Oh, I didn't create it. Tzimtzum, right? Tzimtzum means he removed some of the light, and now there's darkness. But in the reality, in the circle, in the empty space, what is there now after darkness? So the first thing God did, God he didn't create it, but it was the first act, the first thing God did to lead to creation was tzimtzum, concealment. However, the concealment wasn't an end in and of itself. Right? God didn't conceal to conceal. God concealed so that he can then reveal. If God would have left the initial infinite light, there'd be no space for others, right? If Newton walked into the room and just left his mind running the way he thought to himself, no one would understand the word he's saying. So he has to conceal his big idea. But why is he concealing it? Not because it's a bad idea and he doesn't want to share it with anyone, but because he wants to share it. But in order to share it, he has to share it bits at a time. So he has to conceal it. Why is he concealing? For the sake of revelation. There's a purpose. The purpose of the concealment is revelation. Now, Hasidus teaches us that this pattern trickles down into the entire Seder Hishtalshalos, the entire order of devolution, from the highest levels we spoke about all the way down to our world. First comes what? Darkness. The world was, the second verse we discussed last week, first it was Tohu. Right? It was dark, it was chaos. Then what happens? Then God says, let there be light. How does the Torah say, how does the Torah divide time into days, right? In Genesis 1, Torah divides time into days. And each day is put together of a night and a day. Why didn't God just create days and nights? And if you want to make a Shabbos every once a week, so create 14 units, 7 of them light, 7 of them dark. Why does he have to create 7 units, each one consisting of light and dark? Not only that, what comes first? We know this from halachic days, from Shabbos, from holidays. Night. The Jewish day starts at night. And what does it say in Genesis 1? At the end of each day. So let's look at text 8a. Genesis 1:5. There was evening and there was morning one day. So in other words, a unit is one day, and the day is made up of light and dark. And what comes first? Dark. This verse informs us that there is no day without a night that precedes it. Why must it be so? Why does a day not exclusively consist of daylight hours, or perhaps just the night hours? Why must it include both evening and morning, and why must night precede the day? The root of the matter is that at the source of creation, there was evening before morning. That is, darkness preceded light. For the tzimtzum preceded the sharing of God's kindness. This darkness-light combination extends to all the worlds, including our world, where night precedes day. So in other words, our reality reflects its source. Up there, there's tzimtzum. Down here, we have night. Up there, there's gilui. There's the kav, the line that comes through that reveals God's presence. Yeah, that's light down here. Just like tzimtzum came before gilui, so night comes before dark. Let's read text 8b. This is the conclusion, the obvious conclusion, the analog of the metaphor. We observe the same pattern reflected in the affairs of the world, whereby individuals do not achieve growth in wealth, leadership, building a family, study, or any other accomplishment without first experiencing humiliation, pain, loss, and the like. For example, individuals engaged in study will not arrive at a complete understanding of the subject without much toil and stress, feeling distant from understanding and tempted to despair from mastering the subject. Indeed, the Talmud states, one does not understand statements of Torah without first being mistaken. We observe the same in earning a livelihood, whereby we succeed only after putting forth great effort and enduring much pain, even feeling despair. Only thereafter do we find profit and great blessing. This is the way that God's blessings flow in the upper worlds and travel down to the lowest realm. There is no light without the darkness that precedes it. As it is stated, according to the pain is the reward. So, if we aren't experiencing any struggle, if we're never failing, it likely means we have a lot more potential to grow. And we're not tapping into it. Absolutely. Failure teaches us more than victory and success. Knowing this empowers us to avoid feeling demoralized when we face adversity, when we face challenges. And this is not only in our even in our in spirituality. We want to do a mitzvah, and we say we're going to do it. We try to do it, and then it doesn't work. It's not happening. We miss it once, we miss it twice, we fail here, we fail there. If you're failing, that means you're going somewhere. If you're not failing, that means you're not traveling there. Right? If you don't get into a car crash, then God forbid, don't you get into a car crash. But if you don't feel the bumps in the road, that means you're sitting at home. And if you're sitting at home, you're not going anywhere. If you're feeling the bumps, that means you're traveling. This principle in today's psychological world, psychiatrical world, is also known as post-traumatic growth. There is an idea in psychology. There's a whole theory from a psychologist, I think maybe in North Carolina somewhere, that we had a video presentation about it in one of the earliest courses we did. I don't remember which one, where there was a soldier that was injured in Iraq and then later was redeployed in Afghanistan, and 6 months after he went back was diagnosed with PTSD and sent home. And later he was interviewed, or he was part of a study. I don't know exactly how they got his information. And in his mind, his feelings were that he grew exponentially as a result of those injuries. Before he was just sitting and taking life. He was playing video games. He wasn't serious about life. He wasn't taking anything seriously. He was just going through life, absent-minded. He attributed a lot of his maturity and a lot of the things he did specifically to the injuries he experienced. I don't know the psychology behind it or all the details, but there is such a field as post-traumatic growth. And this is the idea. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, in the 1920s, when it became illegal to teach Torah or to share Judaism with anyone in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, the previous Rebbe established an underground network of yeshivas and mikvahs and shuls. Eventually, in 1927, he was arrested, tortured, sentenced to death by his firing squad. However, because of international pressure, his sentence was commuted, and he was eventually kicked out of the country, and he went to Latvia, to Riga. When he was there, he was once asked about his feelings of everything that happened that he experienced in the Soviet Union. So text 9. This is what the Frierdiker Rebbe responded. If someone would offer to sell me a single moment of additional suffering for $1 billion, I would not buy. But if someone would offer to purchase a single moment of my past suffering for $1 billion, I would not sell. In other words, Moses knew that darkness comes before light. And yet he asked God, why are you torturing this people? Well, he didn't know that after Egypt we got the Torah? Didn't he know that we need darkness before light? Yes, but he also knew that God can override the system. And so we pray every day, every moment, anytime we pray to God, that we shouldn't have to go through the darkness, that our family and friends shouldn't need to experience darkness. And if they are experiencing darkness, we pray to God to turn the darkness into light. But that's for the future. The darkness that we have experienced or that we are experiencing and we can't get out of, we need to start looking at it as the precursor for light. Just like the Tzimtzum came before the revelation. This will help us in a lot of areas. Today, we learned what is probably the most difficult concept in Kabbalah to explain and to understand, the concept of Tzimtzum. I know it sounded very elementary. We all understand it, right? Sure. There's many mountains of material on this. It's not very simple. Every text we read, there are other texts that seem to contradict, and there's a world of study out there on this, but this is the idea in a nutshell. And a major idea of today's lesson is that the understanding of Tzimtzum is not literal, a withdrawal, but a concealment, which means we are way closer to God than we can ever imagine. You know, if God were outside of us, it would help us sometimes not feeling so upset at why does God let such bad things happen to good people? Why does God let this happen to me? But if we remind ourselves that the Tzimtzum is not literal, and even though I can't see God, he's here just as much as he was if I would be able to see him. And therefore, I could have a relationship with him in a very intimate and real way. Sure, it might be easier to think he's out there. It might answer some questions, but it doesn't help the relationship God wants to have with us. It's very easy to think about it one night and forget about it tomorrow. That's why it's important to study Hasidus, study these Kabbalistic ideas, not just as Kabbalistic ideas, but the way Hasidus explains them, the way it's brought down into our lives, how we relate to them, how we can change from them, how we can improve from them. And the ultimate realization of turning darkness into light will be the theme of next week's class, when we will attempt to discuss God's essence, whatever that means, or whatever we can attempt to get to, and the ultimate purpose of creation. So what we discussed till now is Seder Ishtalshus. We discussed from the Tzimtzum, from the first step, all the way to our world. But what brought that about? What made the Tzimtzum? Why was the Tzimtzum made? So that all of this world can come into being. You'll have to come back next week. Just a reminder, you can find all of the videos and PowerPoints and more information at this link. Next week, we will have our last lesson in this course. Next Thursday night is the first night of Hanukkah. God willing, at the center, 5:30, for all of those who can make it. I know some of you already, most of you already told me you're coming. Those of you who are coming. And if you know anyone that would benefit from an invitation, please share the invitation with them. Unfortunately, this year you will not be getting a postcard, a physical postcard in the mail, but it's on the website, it's on Facebook, and feel free to invite whomever you think would benefit from this. Let me just